Hey, everybody, and welcome to Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. On the show today, how Iranians are reacting to the country's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, and what it means for a nation at war. But first, we are getting mixed signals from the Trump administration about the war in Iran. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth walked up to the Pentagon podium this morning with the following message.
Today will be, yet again, our most intense day of strikes inside Iran. The most fighters, the most bombers, the most strikes. Intelligence more refined and better than ever.
But last night, President Trump downplayed the conflict, calling it a, quote, little excursion and predicting it could end soon. So today we're asking, which is it? An exit ramp from the president or escalation from the Pentagon? I want to bring in NBC News senior national security correspondent, Courtney Kube. Hey, Court.
Hi.
So at this Pentagon briefing this morning, which you were at, I heard your voice, I heard you ask a question. Secretary of Defense Hegseth said it's going to be the most intense day of strikes inside Iran. And he described what that could mean.
One, destroy their missile stockpiles, their missile launchers, and their defense industrial base. Missiles and their ability to make them. Two, destroy their navy. And three, permanently deny Iran nuclear weapons forever.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we're not getting a whole lot of facts in these briefings, which is really frustrating. There is sort of a vague list of the sorts of targets that they're going after. But we don't have actual numbers and details to go behind provided by the U.S. to actually back up a lot of these. Now, I've been trying to run down what Secretary Hegseth meant when he said this is going to be the biggest or most intense day yet. The best I can get, because every single day I ask this, what's new today? What's changing in the operational tempo?
Why is today more intense than yesterday?
Exactly. The best I can understand is as they go along, the U.S. is moving further and further towards the middle of the country. They're pushing further east. As they do, they take out more air defense systems. It does seem that they've taken quite a few of them out. They're going after now drone production facilities. So they are able to, as they move further in and it becomes safer airspace for them, they're able to bring in more manned aircraft, which just means they may have more aircraft up there today that are flying safely. But at this point, we have no indication they're targeting anything different or that there's any change in the operations.
I mentioned the question that you asked at this briefing this morning, and it was about the school children that were bombed in the southwest of Iran. We talked to Molly Hunter about this last week. Over 100 kids were killed. It was a Tomahawk missile that we now know that hit this school. What did Hegseth have to say about this? Because the United States has Tomahawks. Iran does not have Tomahawks, despite the fact that the president has continuously said it was Iran, it wasn't us.
All we're getting out of the Pentagon officially, and at this point, Secretary Hegseth is really the only one who's authorized to speak about it from the Pentagon. All we're getting is that it remains under investigation. But the people who we're talking to about this behind the scenes are telling us it just looks increasingly likely that this was a United States strike. It's still not clear whether it was bad targeting, whether there was bad intelligence, exactly what happened here. There's over 170 people believed to be dead. Many, if not most of them, little kids. I understand that formal and official investigations take time, but it is almost impossible to conceive of the U.S. military not having evidence that points to who is behind this. They should have satellite imagery. They should have infrared imagery. They should have the targeting list from that day. They know they were targeting in the region. They should have a good sense of this. And the reason that I ask that question is because is there accountability and is there any effort to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again? And unfortunately, we're not getting answers to that.
Speaking to the lack of information and confusion coming from top on down, as we're talking about what's happening coming out of the Pentagon, we also have what seems to be a little bit of a different message coming from the White House. The president had this press conference yesterday, and he essentially said this thing is almost over. We're there, right? We've won. How do you square that?
So the best that I can tell is the president is talking about some of the basic military objectives here. And they have made a lot of progress in some of them. Taking out the Iranian Navy, more than 50 ships have been sunk. Now, they still have small, fast boats, and those are not insignificant. Degrading the Iranian ballistic missile program. Absolutely. They have taken out a huge percentage of their launchers. They're going after their production capabilities. They're going after their stockpiles. It's not decimated, but they have gone after a lot of them. The drones are a different story because Iran had tens of thousands of drones going into this. They had a production capability that allowed them to make, we don't even know the official number, but there are estimates of hundreds, if not even thousands of them every single day. So that is a bigger target, and the drones are a significant threat and a significant capability. These are the short-term military objectives that we've been told about, but we know there are medium and longer range objectives here that are both military and potentially diplomatic, maybe economic, and no one will talk to us about exactly what that is. At times it's about regime change. Even at times they talk about nation building. It's about a potential partnership between the U.S. and Iran over oil. We don't know what that's going to look like, and because it's been so foggy and so fuzzy, at this point, it's plausible they could call a military win and walk away.
How do you have a partnership with Iran when you're bombing the regime?
I mean, at this point, I'm sure they have plans for all of these things. The question is, are the objectives changing? Are they changing the goalposts constantly? They have actually made a lot of progress militarily. Now, they have taken some hits militarily as well. The U.S. bases throughout the region many of them have taken hits. We know about the service members who have been injured and killed in this so far. But the question is, are they changing some of the objectives? Because it's getting tough. With gas prices, with the economy, with public sentiment about this, is it possible that they just want to cut the ties? I really don't know the answer to that. It seems to be a day-to-day question.
We know that this president is driven by deals. He's driven by trade. He's driven by money. He's driven by the economy, right? When he feels as if there is pressure on him from that sector, when you look at what's happening with oil prices as well, what is the Pentagon's plan in order to keep that trade flowing through the Strait of Hormuz so long as this war is ongoing?
They have a huge undertaking to do this because, again, it goes back to the drones. The real threat in the Strait of Hormuz are Iranian drones. We keep hearing that they were able to take out a ship that's actually a drone launcher. That was a big win for the U.S. military when it comes to cutting down the threat in the region. I feel like for decades we've talked about the threat from Iranian mines in the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf and down, but that's not the real big threat. As long as they have a drone arsenal, the shipping in the Strait of Hormuz is in jeopardy. And the notion that they can use U.S. Navy ships, that's a huge undertaking as well. And it's a huge threat to those Navy ships. They have the ability to take some of these drones down. They can defend against missiles. But if there's a barrage of them, all it takes is for one to get through, for a tragedy to strike. And then what happens to this war? If, in fact, they're able to hit a U.S. Navy ship. I don't see a real solution to the threat that exists in the Strait of Hormuz and throughout that region to commercial shipping unless the Iranian drone program is severely curtailed.
We've been kind of asking this again and again. I'm not sure if you have the answer to it, but the question is there an off-ramp? Are there folks inside the Pentagon that are seen as kind of the quote-unquote voices of reason that are advising the president as to how to get out of this thing, when to get out of this thing, when to call it, how to transition to whatever objective it is that they want to fulfill?
So I don't know that those people exist in the Pentagon. Secretary Hegseth keeps the people in the Pentagon who have direct access to the president to such a small group. I think there are a lot of outside government people who are talking to the president about these things. So here's the only real off-ramp that I see that essentially pulls the U.S. out of this right now, and it won't be clean. But that is, again, they have these defined military objectives: ballistic missile program, the Iranian Navy, and destroying their ability to project power. That's somewhat ambiguous, right? So they can say that they have cut down their ballistic missile production, their facilities, their launchers and things, 95%, whatever it is, get to just about 100%. They can take out the Navy. They can really decimate the Air Force. They can pock up the runways. They can cause so much damage to the Iranian military and security infrastructure that they are set back years. And candidly,
but the regime is still in place.
The regime is still in place. And guess what else is? Their nuclear program.
Their nuclear program is still in place.
They still have not gone after the nuclear program. But if they really wanted a quick off-ramp, they could essentially achieve those objectives. They could say, look, we've done it. We have hurt them militarily. We have set them back by years, if not decades. And now it's up to the Iranian people to figure out the governance or to overthrow, to topple the regime. And then, candidly, the administration could walk away. That would be a very, potentially very messy outcome. But candidly, I don't see any other way for the U.S. to get out of this quickly.
Courtney Kube, thank you.
Thanks.
We learned today that 140 U.S. service members have been wounded since the war in Iran began 10 days ago, and 8 service members remain listed as, quote, severely injured. So one of the really difficult things about reporting on the Iran war is actually getting a handle on what is happening inside the country from the Iranian people themselves. But Shooka Bidarian has found a way, even with the internet shut down there. She is an independent journalist covering Iran, and she is joining me now. Salam, Shooka.
Salam, Yasmin. Khasta nabashi.
Khasta nabashi. It's great to have you, Shooka. Thank you for joining us. You are based in London, but you have been speaking to people inside of Iran and doing reporting on what has been happening there over the last 10 days or so. You have gathered voices together from people inside Iran to kind of understand the sentiment of the Iranian people. This is audio and video that we personally here at NBC have not verified. Without revealing your sources and people that you've been talking to, walk us through how it is you've been able to gather some of this reporting.
Absolutely. First thing first, your viewers and your listeners should know that the trust that people of Iran inside Iran have in me, it's because of many years of working as a journalist for Monato TV, which is a Farsi-speaking channel based in London. And right now, ordinary people in Iran are deprived of the most basic human rights when it comes to information and safety. The government has shut down the internet. People cannot communicate with one another, and satellite dishes are being targeted so that people are pushed back to watching only state television rather than, let's say, Monato TV and all the Farsi-speaking channels and news outlets outside Iran. At the same time, the government openly admits that some people are being given privileged access to internet. Today, I was listening to the news and the government spokesperson, Fatemeh Mohajerani, said that certain individuals are being provided with unfiltered internet so that they can convey the government's voice to others. In Iran, this is often called white internet, while ordinary people are left trying to access the outside world through extremely expensive, at the moment, black market VPNs, if they can access anything at all. And yet people still try to speak. In my own case, I receive messages, videos, especially at the beginning. It's been a lot more difficult during the past few days, voice notes and even short phone calls from dozens of people across Iran. Sometimes I tried to count it the other day, since the protest and the mass killing in January, around 50, 60 individuals in different cities reached out. When you listen to their testimonies, a pattern begins to emerge. Despite being in different places and speaking independently, they often describe the same conditions and the same fears. And that's why I'm here today, simply as a messenger. So thank you again for having me.
I want to go through, though, some of the videos that you have sent me from people in Iran. And I want to talk first about what has happened over the last 48 hours. And that was the selection of Mojtaba Khamenei as the next supreme leader of Iran. And I think a lot of people are wondering, what is the sentiment inside the country? And listen, we've been seeing videos online of obviously, thousands, if not millions of Iranians in the streets celebrating his selection. But the videos that you have been getting when it comes to whether or not people support or oppose Mojtaba Khamenei communicate a very different message. In fact, some of the videos that you have sent to me are saying, Marbar Mojtaba. Death to Mojtaba. How uncommon is it inside Iran to stand on your rooftop, to shout from your window, death to the supreme leader? What does that say to you?
I sometimes like to think that Iranian people are very creative when it comes to wanting to show to the world and others how they actually feel. And right after the 2 days of mass killing in January on the 8th and 9th, people started shouting slogans on the rooftops, which usually occurs at night as well. And of course, they do record the videos and send it to us. And at the beginning, we would hear a lot of death to Khamenei, but it was quite interesting to then start getting videos now after the announcement of the leadership of Mojtaba that people are now chanting death to Mojtaba. And for many years already, a large number of Iranians have come to the conclusion that the entire system of the Islamic Republic has failed. It's not just the hardliners they reject, the likes of Ali Khamenei and Mojtaba Khamenei. What has changed over the past decade is that many people have also stopped believing in the so-called reformists, figures who were once presented as alternatives. Rouhani, Zarif, even Mir Hossein Mousavi are now seen by many Iranians as part of the same political structure. It's also important to remember that some of the most brutal repression happened while these so-called reformists were in power. In 2019, during nationwide protests, the regime shut down the internet across the entire country. And according to reports, around 1,500 people were killed in just 3 days. And that time, Rouhani was in office as the president. So when people talk about the future, they are not just talking about reform inside the system anymore. They are talking about the system itself. And from the messages I've been getting from inside Iran, Iranians have found challenging is the myth that there is no credible opposition leader. Thousands of people have lost their lives in the streets of Iran while chanting Pahlavi will return to Iran. Long live the king. Reza Pahlavi is our national slogan.
It's interesting, though, because for a long time, the former crown prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, who you're talking about, did not necessarily seem like someone who could be a credible leader inside Iran, and certainly did not have the support of a lot of Iranians. It seems like also there is a shifting sentiment inside the country, which I think is important to speak to. The people that I've been speaking to, right, there is a sense of hope that there is a possibility of real regime change. But now feeling as if with the appointment and selection of Mojtaba Khamenei, that there is a worry that this regime will in fact stay in place, will be able to, ward off the efforts of American and Israeli forces to remain in power. Is that what you're hearing as well?
Absolutely, Yasmin. That's exactly what I was noticing. Earlier messages right at the beginning of the strikes was messages of joy and hope that USA and Israel have finally come to help the people of Iran to liberate their country, and that Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, responsible for the killing of tens of thousands of Iranians, is dead. But then right now, the messages I have been receiving over the past few days, there's been a growing concern and a lot of fear. People obviously are receiving threats from security forces, from the IRGC and Besiege. And by the way, some of these videos now shared on social media, Besiege units on motorbikes have reportedly been moving through neighborhoods in different cities, chanting slogans, accusing people of being spies or mercenaries, and then threatening them in the middle of a war. They chant, "We will kill you, we will kill you." And so I have actually just managed to get a message from the person who sent me one of the rooftop chanting videos that I sent to you on the first day of the attack on February 28th. And they have been without internet until today, March 10th, right? And so they said to me, I'm going to just read this. They said, when strikes happen, people feel hopeful. When they stop, people feel disappointed. What we fear most is the Islamic Republic remaining in power. So this was the message I received today, but over the past few days, I have received similar messages as well. So one person said that the explosions were so intense last night, people thought that it might be the final night before a ceasefire like the 12-day war with Israel. But then they added something really striking to me. They said, the fear of a ceasefire and being left with this regime in power is more terrifying than the bombing itself. So many have told me we are willing to risk losing our lives in these bombings if this means ending 47 years of the Islamic regime.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.